Okay, good morning, everybody. Well, great to see so many of you here this morning or this afternoon, depending where you are. My name's Jonathan Carr-West. I'm Chief Exec of LGIU. Really delighted to welcome you all here to our first Global Executive Panel for 2023, which we're really pleased to be hosting with our partners, the Improvement Service in Scotland. It's the first time we've partnered with one of them on one of these events, and we're really excited about it. Look, at LGIU, we think that the most innovative and effective answers to some of the global challenges that we all face are coming from local government all around the world. But we also know that for many of you who work in local government, it's quite hard to find the time to connect with what colleagues in other councils, in other countries, in other places, find out what they're doing. That's not easy. So that's what these events are about, is to sort of help us get some insight of how people in different places are tackling some of the same challenges. So we try and bring together practical insights and ideas from senior execs and local authority experts from all over the world. We've been doing this for about 3 years now for our members and others. So look, before we introduce our topic, I just want to say good morning to all of you who are LGIU members joining us from across the UK. Good evening to our colleagues in Australia. Great to see all of you again. For any of you who don't know LGIU, we've been around for 40 years. We're the UK's biggest independent local government membership body. We've got more than 250 councils subscribing to our network in England, in Scotland, in Ireland, and in Australia. We're non-partisan. We're run by our members, for our members, and anyone, any councillor, any MP in an LGIU member organisation is also a member and gets full access to all our services. So look, that's enough about us. Just want to do, I'll introduce the speakers in a minute. I just want to do a quick bit of housekeeping before we kick off. We are recording today's session. It'll be shared with our members after the event, so don't feel the need to take verbatim notes. You can come back and watch the recording if there's anything you miss. If you have any technical issues, feel free to use the chat box to reach out to Simone and the LGIU team, and they'll take care of you. I think that's it for housekeeping. So very quickly on our speakers, I'm going to hand over in a minute to Hannah McCulloch, who's the National Coordinator for Local Child Poverty Action Reports at IS, the Improvement Service. And she's going to talk a little bit about our topic today. We're then going to hear from we're then going to hear from Mary Agostino, who's the Director of Advocacy and Community Services at Mitchellshire in Australia. Then Alison Allen, who's Chief Exec of NILGA, the Northern Ireland Local Government Association. We've then got Rory Sherwood-Parkin, who's Corporate Lead for Policy and Insight at South Tyneside in England. And finally, Paul Vaughan, who's Head of Communities and Neighbourhoods in Fife Council in Scotland. So we're covering Northern Ireland, England, Australia, Scotland. So it's quite a wide sweep we're going to take. We will hear from each of them for about 10 minutes. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A from you guys. I mean, let's say Q&A, a conversation, all of us together, not necessarily just Q&A. And then we will finish at 9:30. My single skill in life is finishing meetings on time. So I promise you that we will let you go by 9:30. So hopefully that sounds like a good way to spend the next hour and 26 minutes of your life. If it doesn't, the advantage of an online world is you can slip away and we won't notice, but I would encourage you to stay because we have some great speakers and some great conversations to come. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Hannah McCulloch, who, as I said, is the National Coordinator for Local Child Poverty Action Reports at the Improvement Service, and she's going to set the framework for what we're talking about today. Hannah, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. Please excuse me, I'm full of the cold. My voice is absolutely awful. So I will try to be as brief as I can so you don't have to listen to this barking noise. As Jonathan said, my name's Hannah McCulloch. I'm the National Coordinator for Local Action on Child Poverty for the Improvement Service. And I just want to set a bit of context from a Scottish perspective about supporting families and children in the context of a cost of living crisis. For the Improvement Service, which is the National Improvement Organisation for Local Government in Scotland. So we help to develop capability and capacity for improvement within local government. We provide research, data and intelligence to inform local government's policy making and decision making. And we also provide consultancy and support to enable the sharing of good practice at local, national, international level. So my role involves supporting local areas to tackle child poverty effectively, and also to support that sharing of learning and good practice. And in terms of child poverty, we're, as I'm sure you're all aware, operating in an extremely challenging context at the moment. Even before COVID or the cost of living crisis, 1 in 4 children in Scotland were classed as living in child poverty, using a relative poverty measure. And I'm sure you're all well aware of the impact that living in poverty has on children in terms of their health, their well-being, their attainment. There are areas of Scotland where a child born in the most deprived area is likely to have 19 less healthy years of life than someone living in a more affluent area, which doesn't cease being shocking no matter how many times you say it. And so, as well as the sort of moral imperative we have to address this problem for our children, there's also the financial and the economic cost of child poverty, which is estimated to be £29 billion a year in the United Kingdom. And a lot of that cost will fall on councils and on their community planning partners and really undermine their ability to support their communities and to thrive. So in Scotland, there have been major policy and legislative commitments around child poverty. We have the Child Poverty Act, which was unanimously passed in Parliament in 2017, and that set for the Scottish Government really ambitious poverty reduction targets for 2030, so not that far away now. And this has been the impetus for major policy change and investment. So the flagship policy is the Scottish Child Payment. That's a £25 a week benefit for low-income families, for every child in those families. So it's really quite a significant investment. And there is, the figures are unclear. It looks as if child poverty is remaining relatively stable in Scotland while it starts rising a bit in England, although the figures don't bear that out fully yet. They're not reliable enough at this point. And it's thought that amongst the poorest 30% of households in Scotland, incomes have been boosted by about £2,000 as a result of these kind of policy commitments, but that still isn't keeping up with rises in the cost of living in Scotland. So there's a huge amount still to be really concerned about. The cost of living disproportionately affects households with children. They're seeing bills on average 30% higher than other household types. We know families, despite the child poverty rate being quite stable, are living more precariously than they were. There's been a 30% increase in food bank use in the last year. There are 50% more children in deep poverty than there were 25 years ago. And although we keep hearing that inflation is tapering in Scotland and the UK, and we're estimated to see the end of this cost of living crisis, prices and food prices in particular are still predicted to rise throughout the rest of the year. So we are not by any means at the end of this cost of living crisis, and families with children are bearing the brunt of that massively. And it's a massive challenge for local government. They're just out of a public health crisis in terms of COVID, and they're now in another public health crisis, which is the cost of living crisis. And I think bearing that link between public health and poverty in mind is really vital. So I get a kind of insight into the local government response through looking at local child poverty action reports and also facilitating a peer support network for those leading on child poverty at local level. I don't have a lot of time, just some of the key characteristics of the nature of the response at local level. There has been a real move, I think, towards a more dignified approach to supporting families, less being comfortable with the idea of vouchers and food banks, and a shift towards a cash first approach, whether that's direct cash payments for families or the first port of call being income maximisation advice and ensuring people are getting the benefits they are entitled to, rather than vouchers, which had become increasingly common pre-COVID. We're seeing as well better and more innovative use of the data that local areas hold on families. And I think this is partly a result of COVID, that there was a new openness to sharing the data that we had about families, which families were vulnerable, which might need extra support, and engaging with the voluntary sector, third sector organisations, and sharing information about how we how we reach those families, and also using data and intelligence to model where we think pockets of unreached people or people in need might be. And there's been a leap forward in that, but I feel like there's a slight withdrawal as people get more and more concerned that the freedom that they had as a result of COVID is being withdrawn, and they're concerned about legal repercussions in terms of data sharing. And again, we've seen an openness to partnership working that wasn't there before in terms of delivery through the third sector. We've seen some areas have made third sector organisation trusted deliverers. They will give them cash to deliver to families that they think are struggling with the cost of living crisis. But that is being undermined because of the financial pressure that local areas are under, and third sector organisations are unfortunately some of the first to feel the brunt of those cuts, and so are losing that relationship with communities. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot to celebrate in terms of local government proving its worth in how reactive and how close it is to communities in these crisis situations, but a lot of big questions. And I think for me, some of the questions I'm keen to explore: how do we balance needing to respond to this very urgent need, you know, kids that don't have food, massively urgent, with the need to focus on longer term poverty alleviation through employment, through childcare, through transport, through economic development. We need to keep our eye there, but how do you balance that? How do we make services so intuitive that we avoid crisis for families, that we know earlier on that they're in trouble and can address that before all the harm and trauma that comes with that crisis? And how do we understand the impact of what we are doing in a way that allows us to convince others that it's valuable and is not just worthy of support, that it's something that is vital, that has to be supported? So hopefully we'll cover some of that today. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Mary Agostino, who is the Director of Advocacy and Community Services at Mitchellshire Council in Australia. And Mary is highly experienced in local government with an extensive record of achievement, and she's a proven track record of success in delivering quality services and infrastructure to support the needs of communities. So I'm sure she'll have a great deal to say on this topic. Thanks, Mary.
There'll be always someone who's on mute in the room. That'll be me. But thank you, everyone. And just to give you a bit of context of where our shire sits in Victoria, Australia. So we are in the north of Victoria. So anyone who's been to Melbourne, not far from Tullamarine Airport. But what we are as a municipality is on the fringes of Melbourne. So if you think of some of the most vulnerable communities, that's who Mitchell Shire is. We are a growth council, so the state of Victoria has considered us a growth council. So when you come up our corridor, there's houses like mushrooms being built. We've got 2,500 square kilometres, and in the furthest point of our municipality, we've got a town that if it was its own local government area, it'd have the highest family violence rates in the state. So just to give you a bit of context that we're dealing with high levels of vulnerability. And in the southern part of our municipality, which is the growth areas, is what's called our affordable housing for our state. So you can buy a house and land package, and the world is really fantastic once you've done that. But we've had 10 interest rate rises in a matter of the same amount of months in Victoria, in Australia. So the pressure, the financial pressure on families is extreme. The other thing, just to give you a bit more context, is, and I know that every country is suffering, interest rate rises, and that's why we've all gathered, because we've all got the same pain points. My role in the council is by title advocacy and servicing the community. So it's this real interesting mix. One thing in support of families, and I've worked in growth areas a lot of my career, and I've worked in metropolitan councils as well, is that all families aspire the same way. You know, they want the best for their children, they want good outcomes. But what we have found across growth areas is it's a mortgage belt. So one thing that we've solidly done at our municipality is exactly what you just mentioned. We've been partnering as strongly as we can with the not-for-profit sector, which I think you called the third sector just now. I call it the not-for-profit, but same thing, is to help us deliver quality services to families before they become vulnerable. So what we've been working on, and I'll give you a really prime example, is we know vulnerability will happen in our growth areas. We know we are the mortgage belt of Victoria, Australia. So what will happen historically is that people come in aspirational into our new suburbs. Once they can't make ends meet because cost of travel, petrol, on the fringes of Victoria, where there is no transport options, becomes unattainable. Once the congestion, because the connectivity, the road connectivity, the public transport isn't there, the people with deeper pockets move out. So what we begin to develop is a social, it sounds wrong, but a social underclass that, you know, you lose some of that more aspirational community and you want them to stay in our suburbs. So we start off in a particular way and then, you know, we end up sometimes on the margins. Anyway, so some of our work is really to advocate as well, work with partners and facilitate good outcomes. And we do that by, and I was started by saying, I'll give you an example. We're working with philanthropy at the moment. 2 organisations, one called Kids First. And what they've managed to do is secure us $1 million to do some really early preventative work in our growth areas to capture those families who might need some financial support, who might need some assistance in terms of service access for their children, speech pathology or whatever, and act as a conduit so they don't fall into that gap and become, you know, more vulnerable and more needing to rely on a service system that actually doesn't exist out here. So philanthropy as a response to, you know, assisting families with cost of living. And some practical things is financial planners. They actually are conduits to good financial planners. So rather than fall in a hole, hopefully they have pathways to financial support. The other thing what we've also been using is our universal platforms. So our kindergartens, and for those of you from other countries, here in Victoria, the policy now is universal access to 3- and 4-year-old kindergartens. The 3-year-old policy just came into play recently, and we're starting to roll it out. But what we're saying is we can use our kindergarten sites to work with the third sector again for food relief programs for families. So it's a non-stigmatized environment where we're starting to deliver really fantastic support services to families who are experiencing that difficulty. So we're using the networks and the platforms of our own centres to do a lot of that work and working with our NGO partners. The other thing councils can do is really start planning. And I know that's not reacting to the current climate, but I've been working on planning for our infrastructure and our services with the not-for-profit sector to bring more services in and working with them to advocate to the state and federal governments for more funding. And, you know, recently just working in partnership with our local agencies, we've secured 7 more positions for family violence services locally. So, you know, sometimes when you have poverty happen or cost of living pressures, I don't know, I know it's a gender issue, but you do have it sometimes a slight increase also in some of those other, you know, family violence. We call it the social, I was going to say CFA index, and I'm trying to think what the acronym now fully stands for, but it's our social and economic indicators decline. So it's got a real cause and effect that we're trying to kind of continuously work and stop from escalating in our municipality. The other thing is we've got good debt policy at council. So a good policy that supports communities and is empathetic to their current circumstances. So we don't foreclose and we don't do anything like that. We try and work with families to support them through the pain points. The other thing that I think local government has that is quite special is we can offer some programs that are free and universally acceptable. So if you're struggling financially, but you need to get your children out of the house or into certain programs, we offer library services. Recently, we offered all our summer pools free entry. And that cost us it was almost negligible, because people use the canteens to buy a drink or soft drink or food for their children, but they can enter that door free, and there's no stigma. There's no, how you dress in a bathing suit, it doesn't matter how you come to that service. So there's a range of things local government can do to make life easier for families, easier in terms of not feeling stigmatized if they are vulnerable, working with the not-for-profit sector, advocating further for supports. And I noticed one of our economic development team is in the meeting. One thing that we also do is, I just have been working the last 2 years to get local jobs. Now, if you're on the fringes of Melbourne, in Victoria, and you haven't got access to vehicles, petrol's at astronomical prices, accessing jobs locally is a key deliverable council can facilitate. And just recently, we had a bit of success in that space by being able to secure a freight terminal, which eventually will have 20,000 local jobs. So they're things that also, from an economic development perspective, we can really work hard on. The other thing, to not increase costs to ratepayers, we have a very robust system here at our council in accessing anything that moves in terms of money. So we rely less on council cash, and we rely more on grants, philanthropy, the business sector to help us support outcomes. And I'll give you a really solid example I did at another municipality I worked with. We partnered with the YMCA. The YMCA delivered the capital and delivered they supported the capital delivery, and also provided great low-cost childcare, which was critical to that growth area. So what I'm saying is, council's not the be-all and end-all, but we're the closest to our community, and we know that the pain points they'll experience, and they do tend to lean on council in times when they're rough, and we will see them through our services, whether it's our business areas or whether it's through our maternal and child health or our universal early years services. So we have a moral, as well as, here we're legislated too, responsibility to service our community. But I don't know if my 10 minutes is up and if I'm talking too much. So, I will rely on the facilitator to wind me up. Have I still got a little bit of time or not?
Take another minute, yeah.
Another minute. And one other thing, I know this might not be the question for me to respond to, but you asked the question of how local governments can raise funds given the current cost of living crisis. And I actually don't think local governments need to rely on rates revenue, because there's a whole range. If you form great partnerships, whether it's the private sector developers, we've got developers here you can really work with, for them to deliver a lot of capital infrastructure, which then frees up capital to go into more operational. And I'll give you a very practical example. Our maternal and child health recently, our nurses who service young parents and babies, said we can't service our clients anymore. The high-end needs, financial support, other key social issues. So we were able to at least fund 2 of those positions, a social worker and a family support worker. But had we not been able to partner on reducing some of the other expenditure across council, we wouldn't have been able to really put that into our operational to support families. So the financial modelling of council is really critical to at least allow a little bit of that support for families who are vulnerable. Look, I know I've gone right round the world here, but councils play a critical role in really making their communities feel welcome and part of place. And there's so many opportunities through partnerships, leveraging our facilities and ensuring communities have access to services locally and jobs. So
brilliant. Thank you so much, Mary. That was really wonderful, and I think lots of really concrete examples of how councils can help people. capitalizing on those different touch points that we already have across various services, but then also ending with some of those, actually there are sort of structural issues here, how we finance local government, how we organize councils, how we frame partnerships also plays into that. So that's an incredibly helpful start. We're going to swoop all the way across the world now, from Victoria right round to Northern Ireland. And I'm going to introduce Alison Allen, who's the Chief Executive of NILGA, the Northern Ireland Local Government Association, a role she comes to from a huge amount of experience across the public sector. So Alison, I'll ask you for your take on this issue.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to LGIU for the opportunity to chat to you all this morning. I suppose just to pick off where Mary finished, in relation to the point about councils being so close and so connected to their communities, we think in Northern Ireland that places councils in an absolutely unique position, and not just politically, but in terms of the officials who are supporting the political leadership. Those officials are out in communities every single day, and I think that marks them out potentially from regional or national governments in a way that they have a much better understanding of the needs of the people that they serve. So I'll maybe take each of the points in turn. And I suppose whenever we talk about the support councils are providing to families and children through this cost of living crisis, it broadly breaks down into four main categories for councils and for local government. I suppose the first would be direct interventions, and within that, I think just picking up then on the point made earlier around the importance of dignity in those direct interventions, that's very much a developing conversation here. And during COVID, the reactive nature of our response was very much focused on direct support, food parcels, food banks, financial vouchers. And I think everyone has very supportive now of the notion that actually when people are under so much pressure financially, that dignity is really the most important thing, as a parent or as a partner or as a carer, in terms of how you support someone. And so really those direct interventions fall into you would expect that we are still providing vouchers, food parcels, energy support to communities across all council areas. But there are a lot more enabling services being provided as direct interventions. Things like affordable warmth schemes, where you're looking at the energy efficiency in and around the home, the provision of kitchen equipment, because a lot of people are getting food parcels. That's what we were picking up during the COVID crisis, but they did not have the means or the equipment or the access to the energy in their home to be able to use those food parcels as best they could, and particularly an emphasis on low energy kitchen equipment. And then I suppose just picking up on the theme for later on around I suppose net zero, the importance then of climate responsibility in any of our interventions. So really getting a wind around pre-loved uniforms, pre-loved toys, and reusable product around period poverty, and councils are delivering all of those kind of initiatives from an direct perspective, I should say. On the enabling side, I think it is about realizing that maximizing the income for a family gives that family as much choice as possible, speaking to the dignity point again. And a huge investment is undertaken by councils in relation to advice services, and that is just making sure that people are getting access to all of the benefit support that they have, that there is opportunities to provide support in terms of debt reduction as well, and then any of that kind of wraparound service that people may need, and not directly related to their finances, but just in terms of supporting them as a family. I suppose the next aspect of council support very much focuses on the role of councils as conveners of place, and we think that connection to a local place is the absolute unique selling point of councils. And like Scotland, Northern Ireland has responsibility for community planning partnerships on a local authority basis. Councils are the conveners of those partnerships, and really I think we're probably quite early on in our journey, but the COVID crisis really brought those partnerships to life. because there was a shared understanding of the goal, a shared understanding of the objective, and where we really started to see the partnerships with health, housing, education, councils, and other agencies come to life, including on the point around data sharing. But I totally agree with the point that was made earlier, that actually that freedom that we felt we had, because there was a massive enemy, for want of a better word, in the context of COVID, and we start to see a retrenchment starting to pull back around some of that in terms of how we work with partnerships. So councils are very much conveners of local place. I suppose that leads me on then to the next element of support, which is around supporting economic growth, and councils in Northern Ireland have a lead responsibility for facilitating economic growth. And I suppose ultimately it has two faces. The first around that is obviously around ensuring that the focus on jobs and the obsession we have around creating jobs ensures that there are high quality, high value jobs. And that had been an issue for Northern Ireland. So whilst the number of jobs we are creating every year is fairly good by standards, it wasn't turning into productivity. So they were not high value, high growth jobs. And those are, for us, the kinds of industries that are growing are obviously renewables, which I'll touch on later on. And from a Northern Ireland perspective, the kind of 4-star, 5-star hospitality, and also the tech industry, particularly around cybersecurity and software. So it's making sure then obviously there's a massive matching obsession with the skills development and the pathways and the partnerships obviously with schools, further education colleges and universities, to ensure that people when they have a reasonable prospect, then whenever they leave education, that they're going into a job that actually means that the income coming into their house will allow them that dignity to make the choices for their families and support themselves as best they can. So it's about further maximising the impact there. The other aspect of that is in relation to social value procurement around economic growth. So the Social Value Act is now in place in Northern Ireland, and councils are putting in place supporting policies to ensure that I suppose the procurement opportunities of a council as an anchor institution in their place is actually maximised in terms of payback into local communities. And then I suppose the third aspect of economic growth is very focused then on supporting businesses and providing businesses with the skills and support to develop themselves, not just at that kind of entry point, but also developing business who may already be small, kind of family firms, but enabling them to grow, making sure there is opportunities for investment, making sure there is available land, appropriate land for them to grow their business, obviously, in terms of providing decent, high quality, high value employment opportunities. I suppose finally then, just on that first point, the councils obviously as a sector are a very strong lobbying group. There is significant political leadership. Those politicians are linked very much to their own parties, right through the regional government and up through the UK government as well. So a particularly relevant policy area, which accounts for massive investment in Northern Ireland, was around targeting social needs strategy, which supported what we call the neighbourhood renewal strategy. That's currently under review at the moment, and that strategy was about urban support, and it placed hard geographies around the nature of the interventions. So there were marked out areas in urban areas all over Northern Ireland, and if you fell on one side of a line, you got additional support, and if you fell on the other side of a line, you didn't get additional support. And I think what we have learned as councils through the cost of living crisis and the COVID crisis is that poverty is much more nuanced than a hard line. So therefore our lobbying activity is very focused on making sure the systems are much more flexible and less binary in terms of how we support people going forward. I suppose just moving on then to the point around how net zero will contribute to alleviate poverty and provide employment. Northern Ireland in 2022 had delivered its Climate Act. The regional government is partnering with other public sector organisations and business now to develop the supporting action plan. And we were fairly late to the table on that compared to the rest of the UK. But I suppose just given our politics and given the fabric of our society, there is a massive commitment to just transition in that. And obviously that ensures that people who need additional support should not feel any detriment as part of the transfer to renewables and transfer to a more net zero economy and infrastructure. But from a council perspective, obviously that plan comes with lots of requirements, particularly around adaptation and mitigation in terms of our own emissions as organisations. And as has been referred in other contributions, councils in Northern Ireland are under massive financial pressure from the usual cost of living crisis drivers. And I suppose we are slightly different to the rest of the UK in that councils in Northern Ireland raise 80% of their revenue through local taxes. So we are not as reliant on central government grants. But it is perverse in a cost of living crisis to be using your local taxes as the only means of raising revenue. It's just not the most appropriate way to do that, and our politics is very sensitive to that. So whilst there were unavoidable costs, all councils delivered much lower than inflation local tax raises for the 23-24 financial year, because they're very sensitive to that particular issue. There is also an obsessive focus on obviously ensuring that the skills and economic growth strategy matches obviously the development of our renewable industry. And obviously from our perspective, that brings in the point around ensuring high value, high quality jobs, and ensuring that there is the skills pathways to ensure that people have a good standard of living based on the income coming in. And those enabling industries like tech and software, as I've referred to earlier on, are so important that they're not forgot about in the context of the renewable discussion as well, because they don't sit in isolation. They are very much an enabling industry. We feel quite strongly here that obviously a shift to renewables will stabilise energy costs and obviously provide us all with a wee bit more certainty about the future of individual household finances, which we feel is an important point in relation to how vulnerable families manage those costs going forward. That is probably coming along with the price of food, which is actually the inflation is so much higher in the UK on the price of food. Energy starting to come down, but energy and food are the things that are really pushing people into great difficulty. I suppose just moving finally on to the point around raising funds, totally agree with the point that Mary has made around raising local taxes is not the answer in the middle of a cost of living crisis, particularly when, so our local tax is called rates, but it is separated into household rates and into business rates. There are very fine balances to be struck, and those are difficult political discussions about ensuring that you're focused on growth and not just managing a crisis, but how you do that in a way that is sensitive to affordability. And as I said, councils have delivered inflation busting local tax rises. But the wider issue for us is probably the inefficiency and duplication in the system overall in public services. Excuse me. So we want to become more intentionally focused as organisations on the opportunities that innovation and transformation bring, to ensure that it's not about cutting services, it's not about making more money, but it's about doing more with the money that we have and using the opportunities that, as I say, innovation and transformation will enable in terms of doing that. I say the other aspect is obviously business rates, and so obviously the rateable income is based on square footage. It's the square footage of your home or the square footage of your business, and I say that's the majority of income for councils. But again, there is a massive focus by councils, not just on the development of our own kind of indigenous economies, but also the attraction of foreign direct investment. And obviously the more rateable income, the less from a business perspective, that places less of the burden on the individual household and the individual resident. I suppose we're starting to see some of that come to fruition now in the Republic of Ireland, obviously, where they had a massive focus on foreign direct investment and are now benefiting in the middle of a cost of living crisis from huge tax receipts, which are the Taoiseach yesterday called, I think, I'm not kind of trying to think the right terminology, but it's kind of like a cost of living buffer. So it wasn't money in the bank, it was more like a cost of living buffer. And actually that investment 10, 15 years ago and that obsession around foreign direct investment has meant that the state has been able to provide much more support directly to individuals and to to councils. And again, just picking up on the private partnerships that Mary referred to around developer contributions as well. So supporting public services then when development is happening, and there's a lot of development happening in Northern Ireland, particularly around the big urban conurbations, and that's the partnership with the private sector. And obviously that is all, I suppose, really positive, but just to give you a little bit of context from a Northern Ireland perspective, that we are without a regional government at the moment. So local government is the only form of functioning government directly in Northern Ireland, which makes it very difficult to have real strategic clarity about where we're taking some of these issues, and for what that means for the third sector, what it means for government departments, and what it means for public services, is that we are still without a budget, although we expect the Secretary of State to lay the budget today. But our own politicians are labelling that a punishment budget because of, in his words, failure to reform public services in Northern Ireland over the last 20 years. So councils feel that, I suppose, generally that the recognition and the ability to make local decisions should be enhanced, because we're stable, we are constantly there, we never fall away, and what is happening now is that people are suffering because of the lack of a regional government. So on the council side, we feel very positive for the future, but obviously that we need regional government to be functioning well as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alison. Really interesting to see, both some of the key differences, but also some of the commonalities with what Mary was highlighting. I was really struck by your comment about poverty not being a binary. It's not like you're in or you're out. There's a sort of porous border, and also how quickly this actually needs to lead us into a conversation about public service transformation, and it can't just be treated in isolation. Right, a slightly less dizzying hop across the water now as we go from Northern Ireland to northeast England, and I'm going to introduce Rory Sherwood-Parkin, who's the corporate lead for policy and insight at South Tyneside Council in England, as we have lots of people on the board who might not know that. So Rory.
That's right. Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thanks LGIU for the opportunity. Really interesting conversation so far, particularly the point around partnership, which I know kind of Mary and Alison and Hannah all covered, and I think we're trying really hard in South Tyneside to kind of do that and work closely with partners across the private and voluntary sectors. I think I might be the one with the slides, so I will share my screen, but please let me know if you can't see them. Hopefully that's worked and you can see my screen. Fantastic. It looks like a lot of slides, but I will talk quickly and go through them. So going to cover quite a bit this morning in terms of how we're supporting children and families in South Tyneside in terms of poverty and the cost of living crisis. I'm going to skip through quite a few different topics, but I thought first to kind of set us in context. So just so you know where South Tyneside is, we're a coastal community in the northeast of England, kind of squeezed between two big urban centres in Newcastle and in Sunderland. We have, as we have to say in all our council presentations, an award-winning beach, according to the Sunday Times, and a title-winning football team as well, as of last week. So I have to get that into everything that we talk about. But we're a coastal community, which I think is really important to emphasise, and comes into some of the things that I'll go on to talk about in terms of our poverty rates. And we're quite small as well, so we cover about 150,000 people across South Tyneside, with three main urban centres, the biggest of which is South Shields. So in terms of our current situation and rates of poverty, as it says on this slide, and that graph in the top right-hand corner really sums it up. We've seen big increases in the number of children living in poverty in the borough and the wider region in the northeast, and that was before the current crisis set in. A quarter of our population live in the most deprived 10% of areas in England as well. So real kind of entrenched levels of deep-seated poverty across the borough, and that's been accentuated by the cost of living crisis. So we've picked out a few of those statistics at the bottom of the slide there. So we know our welfare support team, our kind of debt advice team in the council, seen its busiest ever month, and that graph in the bottom right hand corner kind of sums that up. The demand is increasing significantly. Big increase from kind of partners like Citizens Advice, seeing a lot of requests for financial support, food bank demand tripling over the last year, and rough sleeping, albeit from a low base, up by 25%. So some really stark kind of figures as to the impact of the cost of living crisis on what was already a bit of a precarious situation. We know from the kind of evidence-based approach that we've been taking as a local authority and as a partnership that it's particularly impacting certain groups, so particularly kind of families, young single parents, increasingly working families as well. So lots of feedback from our food banks that are seeing more and more working families struggling to make ends meet. Single people and older people maybe too proud to ask for help, back to the dignity point that was made earlier, and a lot of people just above that kind of benefits threshold and are able to access kind of central government support too. And we know this is having a kind of disproportionate impact upon places across the north and the northeast, and that impact itself having a really big effect upon the mental and physical well-being of our young people and our residents, and some really kind of sobering news stories at the bottom of that slide about some of the impacts that this is having. As a council, we've been looking at this for a while in terms of poverty and how we can try and alleviate and reduce rates of poverty across South Tyneside. So one of our select committees set up a poverty commission a few years ago now, and they made a number of recommendations as to how we can try and put interventions in place to help people. And I think one of the key things that has come out of that, which we started last year, was the creation of a kind of multi-agency poverty group. So back to the point that everyone's made around the importance of partnership. So that includes our voluntary sector partners, support agencies like Citizens Advice and Age Concern, teams across the council, private sector, NHS, kind of transport colleagues, anyone that really kind of touches upon this agenda, and we've formed a bit of a group to try and work in partnership together. And one of the first things that we did was to hold a cost of living summit last year, so bringing together all key partners together to talk about real practical action that we could take to kind of help people through this crisis. But as Alison said, also have that kind of eye to the longer term and what longer term measures we could put in place. So we held that summit, and we're also as a local authority been through quite a lot of change over the past couple of years, and created a bit of a new vision and ambitions for South Tyneside, one of which kind of right at the heart of that is about residents being financially secure. So those issues around poverty and trying to tackle those really entrenched issues I talked about at the start are right at the heart of our new kind of vision and ambitions as a place. Really importantly, I think we've tried to ensure that our response is driven by the evidence. So our poverty group, working closely with colleagues, as I said, across the NHS, voluntary sector, other parts of South Tyneside to look at what the evidence is telling us, and to talk to people and to engage and kind of collaborate in that way. So our cost of living summit came up with kind of 5 key areas for us to focus on. So firstly, the intelligence and data to understand the trends and the issues. Secondly, how we could support our communities with practical advice and interventions, how we could signpost people towards available support, increase access to services, particularly for those groups I talked about at the start. And then I think to Alison's point around kind of lobbying and messages to government and other influencers, kind of highlight the issues our residents are facing with key decision makers, has been a really important part of what we've done. So just a few visuals of some of the things that we've done over the past 6 months or so. So we've set up a network of nearly 70 warm spaces across the borough, and that's across kind of public and private and voluntary sector. So we've got churches, football clubs, cafes, restaurants, libraries, children's centres, all involved in areas where people can go and just spend a bit of time if they need to access activities, free food, and more. And we feel this is really working, and it's really helped in terms of some issues around social isolation that we have in the borough. But to that point around dignity, we are slightly changing the name to welcoming places. You'll see in the top left-hand corner, because of that maybe stigma attached to some of that terminology. We've invested in more capacity to help in terms of poverty, so particularly around the debt and welfare support side. So we've got more capacity to deal with issues. And we've tried, as colleagues have said, to do more around income and benefit maximisation, so campaigns around pension credit, around free school meals, and more. We've written to government on various issues, and as you see in the top right hand corner, produce kind of monthly intelligence reports all around the data. And there's a little plug for one of the LGIU blogs that we did in the bottom right hand corner as well. And let's say some of the key interventions that I've talked about. We've tried to share more intelligence with partners and encourage them to do the same. Back to that point around data sharing. We've done a lot around linking people in on energy efficiency schemes and trying to target that at the most disadvantaged parts of the borough, extended our council tax support programme, given issues that people have talked about in terms of that. And signposted residents towards available support. So we've created lots of information around benefit maximisation, and promoted a lot of the work that partners are doing as well, created a single web page on the council's website to make it easier for people to understand, and tried to take a bit of a health literacy approach to that. As I said, increased kind of funding and access to services through things like more funding for our food banks, but also encouraging them to look at things like community shops as well, to move people away from that kind of maybe reliance upon food banks and more towards a more dignified approach through things like community shops and community pantries, which we're rolling out. And as I said, kind of highlighted issues with key stakeholders as well. Conscious of my time, Jonathan, so I'll speed through some of these, but a raft of other things that we've done specifically for kind of children, young people and families, mainly around kind of school uniform vouchers, holiday activities program over the summer, to help people, and kind of food vouchers as well, and looking to build on a lot of that as well. As we say, they're particularly really interesting, I think, around free school meals and what more we can do around that, and encourage government to go a bit further on eligibility as well. Quick bit on impact in terms of numbers. And sorry, this is probably a lot of orange bubbles for the first thing in the morning or the afternoon. Kind of big number of hits on our website where people have gone and accessed information. There's the stats there around the amount of money that we've recovered for residents in terms of benefit maximisation, I think, is really important, and the number of kind of children that we've helped over the summer through food vouchers or through our holidays activities programme is quite stark as well. But it's not just, as colleagues have said, about the numbers. So some kind of nice quotes back from some of the people that have visited our warm spaces or our cost of living summit, and we're doing a big evaluation at the moment on the real impact of the warm spaces in particular. And then going forward, I think as partners have said, this has really helped us to build some of those kind of key multi-agency links across the borough, particularly in certain places where we know rates of poverty are higher. And really importantly, I think, as Alison said, kind of highlighted that need for a bit of a more inclusive approach to economic growth. So some of our next steps are to carry on building that intelligence, more of those comms campaigns around income maximisation, boosting our multi-agency partnership approach in localities, and do more around kind of food provision, crisis support, that kind of white goods support as well, which is something that's come through really strongly, and then more around engagement. So we've got a Poverty Truth Commission starting later this year. We're going to do another poverty summit as well, and then continue to lobby government, continue to work with regional partners too. So lots of stuff happening across South Tyneside, and I hope that was helpful.
Brilliant, it really was, Roy. Thank you so much. I thought that was particularly interesting in terms of the sort of the response to sort of both sides of the dual challenge that Hannah set out at the beginning, of how do you balance kind of trying to do long-term strategic improvement and prevention work with the need to sort of have real sort of immediate interventions for people who are really in desperate need. So I think that it was really interesting on both sides of that. Look, this is now our shortest hop. We stroll, north to Fife, where we're going to hear from Paul Vaughan, Head of Communities and Neighbourhoods at Fife Council. Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I too am going to try and share my screen because I do have a presentation, but my system is not going to let me do that, so I may just have to talk through this. Fife's an area just north of Edinburgh and south of Dundee. We have our newest city in Scotland in terms of Dunfermline. And just to give a little bit more background, we are the third largest local authority in Scotland. I think around about the 10th or the 11th in the UK. We have about 374,000 of a population and around 23% of the households in Fife are classed as workless, and we have 23% of children living in relative poverty before we get to the housing costs, and that sort of changes to about 18.5% of children living in absolute poverty before housing costs. Like I think a number of areas I've talked about, we're not sort of working on our own. In this, we're working as a partnership with not-for-profit, the third sector, and with NHS and all our other community planning partners. And I think one of the things that, against a number of the Scottish authorities will be working in is that sort of broad sort of Scottish and UK policy context within what's particularly in Scotland, the Child Poverty Scotland Act 2017 and our local child poverty action reports, but more generally a number of initiatives or policy priorities that Scottish Government have that impact on the way that local authorities are actually delivering, and some things that we don't necessarily have to be so concerned about because they're getting taken care of elsewhere. Maybe one of the things that hasn't been touched on so far, but is very much a core part of how Fife actually delivers its work with families and with on sort of anti-poverty approaches, is that while we have a number of programs that happen across the whole of the local authority region, we also have been split into 7 smaller area committees. And each of those area committees has their own anti-poverty programme, what we sometimes refer to as the welfare reform and anti-poverty programmes. And we have devolved budgets down to those 7 areas where the local councillors in those areas, working with the partners and working with council officers, develop their own approaches to actually supporting the local families. And local people who are experiencing poverty. And there's lots of very interesting and quite innovative practice that goes on at that local level, some of which is then captured to try and see if we can expand it across the whole of Fife, but sometimes it's tackling a very specific issue in that area, which I think if we were only looking at it from a Fife-wide perspective, we would actually struggle to capture all of those particular issues. And that, I think, has paid dividends over a number of years in terms of building the sort of resilience in some local communities, but also making sure that local partners, the staff who are working in those areas, are well aware of the families, the individuals, the places that they need to go to actually support and help folk. One of the things, though, over the winter that we were involved in was a wholesale sort of winter programme to tackle the cost of living support. So this started around about October, November last year, was really just finishing at the end of last month. And it really had, I suppose, 4 main parts to it. There was an aspect relating to food, one around fuel, one around finance, and one around the sort of general cost of living campaign. And within the food area, we were very much focused in on supporting those organisations that were providing food support to local communities, a small grant scheme that we put in place to allow those organisations to develop and build their capacity. And this is, I think, the 2nd or 3rd time we've done this. We're doing this on a fairly regular basis. And on top of that, to allow individuals and families to know where to go for that type of support, online maps and that are available through the council's website, showing all those locations that folk could go to, and in particular something that we refer to as Cafe Inc. And this is a holiday hunger program that was devised just pre-pandemic when we started this, and I'll say a little bit more about that because it's quite a significant undertaking for the council. In terms of fuel, the warm spaces, which Rory's described, something very similar that we had up here, but fuel top-ups primarily through our housing colleagues going to individuals, and a large amount of funding that was made available to allow folk to access that, alongside an energy advice programme and a very specific sort of smaller project around winter warmer packs for individuals who are living, experiencing fuel poverty. The finance side really tackled the benefits checks and the increase that we saw in terms of really looking at that income maximisation and that benefits checking work. And while we have access, like all Scottish authorities, to something called the Scottish Welfare Fund, we put in place a very specific Fife hardship grant, and we had done this through the pandemic and have kept it going, and it's really a very much a way of either doing the preventive work in terms of getting money into families so that they don't fall into homelessness or destitution, but also as very much a last alternative if they've actually gone through the Scottish Welfare Fund and can't get any more funds through that particular route. And the final thing in terms of the cost of living, and it was picking up a little again about what Rory was talking about in terms of the data and insight, making a lot more use of that data, and on a fortnightly basis coming together as a team across all the areas, talking about what projects were going on in the areas, what the data was actually telling us, what the impacts were that we were actually seeing, was there any barriers that were getting in the way, and trying to remove those barriers as we went through the winter. From that, just to say that we were making grants of over £5,000 to over 72 small food providers across Fife, and in terms of fuel, it was 4,700 fuel top-ups were provided, predominantly to Fife Council tenants, and about the same number of advice sessions that were also provided. The hardship grants itself was paying out an average of around about £530, and that was to just under 1,000 people who received those hardship grants. And in terms of other wider support grants, it was over 20,000, nearly 21,000 in terms of crisis grant awards, and 3,000 in community care. Through the cost of living campaign, we saw quite a lot of activity through the website, but also we had a community support helpline and nearly 2,000 calls that were coming to that, and nearly 3,000 benefit checks. One thing I haven't mentioned is a little bit more detail about Cafe Inc. Cafe Inc. Started just before the pandemic. It's a universal free lunch club for children and families that takes place through each of the school holiday periods. It offers food and drink, family activities, financial support and signposting, all at various locations. I think over the Easter period there, we had 42 locations, 40 across Fife. And to give you a size of the sort of idea of scale of it, throughout across 2022-2023, so from Easter last year through to the end of this year, we put out over 162,000 meals through that route. And it was averaging roughly about 3,500 meals a day that was going out through the holiday periods. The other project, and I wish I could actually show you the screen here for this picture, is something called the Big Hoose. And the Big Hoose is run by a third sector organisation called the Cottage Family Centre, along with support from the council, but most specifically with support from Amazon. And so Amazon have come to an agreement with the Cottage Family Centre, where there are corporate donations coming from Amazon. This tends to be products that are no longer required by Amazon and are then donated through the Big House. And there is a distribution mechanism that has then been set up between the Big House and various local charities and council services. So far, and it's been running just about I think over a year now, over nearly 30,000 products have been distributed via the Big House. And this sort of ranges from household goods, curtains, bedding, through to personal hygiene goods and other types of things. And over 6,000 families have received support through this. Now, this was something that did start again during the pandemic, and it was something that we were doing through council officers, but the third sector have picked this up now, and with a lot of support from local MSPs and MPs and former prime ministers even, it's become quite a significant activity. More widely than the sort of direct support, we've also been working with our physical activity and sports partners across Fife, and really providing free and concessionary access to physical activity and sports centres. Also working with the clubs around cost of living pledges to get them to sign up to making sure that the cost of living didn't get in the way of good health and activity. And in particular, we are working on a very significant project with Sports Scotland in the Leavenmouth area of Fife, where we're working in one particular locality there, Methyll and Methyll Hill, targeting preschool children and young parents, those who are leaving school and older people, to make sure that they've got activity. And just yesterday, I was at a conference or a small summit that we had with all our area teams that was explaining giving the stories of some of the activities that they're actually taking place. In terms of income maximisation, we've done quite a lot of work around boosting budgets with families. That's been something that we've done through education colleagues as well as our third sector colleagues, and also around the school clothing grant, and moving away from it being something that folk had to apply for, but how can we actually just make this something that's going to happen automatically for individuals. Also, what we've noticed, again, it's this picking up this issue around sort of free school meals, that while we know there are over 11,000 children who are eligible for free school meals in Fife, we know that we're only getting around 50 to 60% who are actually taking up the actual offer. And so a lot of work that's going on, engaging with the young people to find out what sorts of information and changes need to happen. So I think the final thing I just want to say is about prevention. And work that's going on at the moment. We worked closely with housing colleagues and social work colleagues within the Kirkcaldy area to look at how we could bring a preventative approach to working with individuals and families, and really getting in at the start of issues. And I think from a social work perspective, beginning to change the attitude of it being about caseloads to something about was how did we actually take a community-based approach to that, and what a community social work approach would be, but are relying on that multidisciplinary team to really sort of make the difference. And that's something that now is beginning to develop into something that we're referring to as no wrong door approach. And again, I think over the coming sort of 12 to 18 months, I think quite significant structural changes that will happen within Fife Council just to allow some of that to progress. So I'll finish there.
Brilliant. Paul, thank you so much. That's really interesting. I was particularly struck by the fact that you also have to think about how you organise your teams within the council, how you measure impact, etc. And of course, it helps if you do have a former prime minister knocking around locally. That's not a bad asset to have. Look, I'm going to open it up. We've got just over 20 minutes for Q&A, so I'm going to open it up to the audience. If you have questions, there are three things you can do. You can raise your hand electronically in a sort of digitally native Zoom style. You can put a question in the chat box, or you can be old-fashioned and just sort of wave at me. If you choose to wave, bear with me because we've got people spread across a couple of different screens, so it may take me a while to spot you, but I will get to you in the end. Who would like to kick us? I've got a load of questions, but I'm not going to indulge myself. I'm going to be good and leave it to audience. Who'd like to kick us off? Questions, comments, or sort of just opening up the discussion, really? Okay, well, while people think about that, I will then abuse my position. Really a question for all of the speakers. What I thought was striking was, we had very different locations. We had Victoria in Australia, we had Northern Ireland, Northeast England, Fife in Scotland. A lot of commonality, as we expected. But was there anything, did any of you sort of hear anything that really surprised you or made you sort of think, oh, that's different, or that's a sort of a different learning point we could take from that? Alison.
It's the old fashioned, Jonathan.
Yeah, no, do it.
I suppose I hadn't really considered the point Mary had raised about how the relationship with philanthropy. And I think, we talk about financing public services, and I'm sure the same pressure is being felt across all of the jurisdictions. I think, we're good at public-private partnerships. That's definitely something that's maturing. We're good at partnerships with our regional and national governments. But I don't think that we're great at cultivating in Northern Ireland those relationships with philanthropic supporters. There was one, I'm not sure if they do international work, but was particularly interested in American billionaire, I think, who ran a program called Atlantic Philanthropies in Northern Ireland. But they were seeking us out at what we weren't, the local authority wasn't cultivating the relationships. And I think there's something there about stepping into that space so that we are not automatically passing the increasing costs of delivering public services onto people who are too hard pressed to deal with it. So just a reflection from me.
That's really interesting. I've got an old-fashioned hand wave from Claudia. Claudia, sorry, I don't know if that's your surname or your first name, but Claudia.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm from Victoria, Australia, not too far away from where Mary is. I'm on the other side of Melbourne, Victoria, in a regional centre, about halfway actually between Melbourne and Adelaide. And yes, I should have typed it in. My surname is Haenel, Haenel. Sorry about that. So I'm a local government councillor, and I'm listening to this with great interest. We have you talked about geographical boundaries, and we in my municipality we have very big swathes of agricultural farming land for broadacre cropping and sheep. We call it dry land agriculture, but also we have our main township, which is Horsham. So it's Horsham Rural City Council, but as I said, halfway between Melbourne and Adelaide. But we have this great disparity between, we have some of the wealthiest sort of dry agricultural landowners that pay massive amounts of rates. And then we have some of the, within the township on the northern side, on the other side of the tracks, as it's referred to, we have, some of the lowest, high rates of poverty as well. So it is so disparate. We have the two ends of the spectrum, I feel, in my municipality. But I guess the question that I'm asking is, and I've lived in other places around Australia and overseas. I used to live in Derbyshire, England, actually. So that was a great time of my life. So I know some of these places. But my question is, my reflection has been that Australia is this massive country with so many different climates. And I have found that in my time that there is this transience of homelessness. I'm not sure whether we experience this in the UK or whether this might just be an Australian thing, but this thing of people moving from the northern parts of our country that are experiencing homelessness, and into our smaller municipalities in the hotter months where it's more comfortable, I guess, to be homeless. And then, moving again back north and transient in our winters back up to the warmer parts of our our countries, because they could get vouchers to get on a bus or a train and travel. So is this transientness of the poverty cycle and the homelessness, is this something, or that I've certainly experienced, is this something everywhere, or do you feel, and Mary might be able to buy in on this too, because she's in it, or is this just an Australian thing? And how could we deal with it? Thank you.
I mean, I'll let panelists come on if they have a view. I think in the UK we don't see necessarily that kind of seasonal transience of homelessness, but what we do see is movement of people. So particularly, there are sort of places that are more so seaside towns suffer a lot from people from other parts of the country migrate to seaside towns and end up homeless there. You get it a lot around in cities around major transport hubs. So I don't think you necessarily see the same pattern of people moving backwards and forwards across different seasons of the year, but you do definitely see sort of people in extreme circumstances moving to places, and that is very challenging, because if you are, say, a seaside town, it can be quite hard to predict levels of demand because you have people turning up. Rory, you're probably the person. Rory and Paul, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we probably experience is we will have travellers and that gypsy traveller community that will come into Fife, sometimes on their way to other places, but we have quite a large gypsy traveller community who have specific locations where there are facilities and housing colleagues will engage with them. We do know that they have accessed some of those services that we've had over the winter and things, but it's not, they are, by the nature of them as a culture and society, they very much stick together and help one another. But we do know that we have to sort of go in and to do some support and engage with them quite widely. I think the other thing that, and maybe this is touching on some of the funding issues, is that the nature of one part of Fife, that East Neuk area, which basically runs from St Andrews, in terms of understand that being the home of golf and things right round the coast there, we've got a lot of second homes, and that being a potential slight drain on the council services over particular times, but also through the changes that are being made around domestic rates and council tax, what funding we can actually raise.
Rory, I'm not sure about South Tyneside, but certainly that there are places within your sort of region where these issues are quite acute.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think they're probably less so in our patch in kind of South Shields and South Tyneside in terms of that transient population that Claudia talked about. I think we suffer less from that. I think probably more of an issue for us as a kind of coastal community in a seaside town is just around the prevalence of low paid employment, which kind of feeds into this. So quite a low wage economy, some of those insecure work and employment trends that we have in the borough kind of impacts upon our rates of poverty. So I think for us, it's more about that challenge about how do we, I think to Alison's point around the low carbon economy, actually, how do we grasp some of those opportunities? In the borough, for example, we've got the operations and maintenance base for the largest wind farm in the world at the Port of Tyne. So there's huge opportunities in terms of the green economy coming through. It's how do we connect local residents to those green opportunities and those jobs that are coming through, and kind of ends that cycle of low paid employment and unemployment, which is leading to kind of those high rates of poverty.
Yeah. We are, I think, planning an event on coastal towns, so watch this space for more.
Excellent.
Alison, I'm not really sighted on how those issues play out in a Northern Ireland context.
No, I don't think they do, to be honest.
No.
I think we don't have the seasonal issues, or indeed the same issues with prevalence of homelessness in council towns, but we do have that. The presentation of homelessness is often focused in obviously on people who are sleeping on streets, but it is much more nuanced, I think, and I think just picking up on that point, you know, around the numbers of homelessness does not correlate in any shape or fashion with the number of people who are actually sleeping on the streets. So it shows it's a much more complex issue, and it is very. We do have the same issues with second homes in Northern Ireland, and obviously, there was a massive influx of people who returned home, maybe from, you know, the Republic of Ireland or from the rest of the UK during the COVID crisis. COVID reprioritised things for many people, but that in itself has actually pushed house prices up. So it has really increased the market and made the problem of rural homelessness much worse for people as well. But the kind of the seasonal transient, it wouldn't be an issue in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, okay. Look, we had a question on the chat from Lucy about the automation of free school meals and school clothing grants, which Paul has very efficiently answered already on the chat. But I wondered, actually, part of that question was about sort of data sharing, and I wondered if, just to get a reflection on the panel, because obviously when we're dealing with issues around sort of poverty, you know, Mary, you talked quite a lot about opening up sort of services that there's no, where there's, you're making it important, there's no stigma for people to sort of come and take advantage of them. But those issues around how you manage and share data about people, have you had to do a lot of working through with that? Because there's quite a lot of sensitivities involved here. Many of you got any sort of experience of sort of thinking that through, how you manage people's data as you sort of seek to support them in this?
Sorry, I'm happy to say something, Jonathan, to that point. We do collect, and I'm picking up on, you know, Rory's and Paul's comments about data. We use evidence as a tool. So we do collect a lot of data, and now what we've started to do, we've got now what's called Orange Doors in Victoria. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're family violence coordination centres. And recently we had to expand ours in our in our municipality, and they wanted to put doors up on everything, so we couldn't hear each other's information. I said, we're dealing with the same clients. So now we've got MOUs. We're about to embark on the MOU to say, you know, we're going to respect each other's data, but, you know, we can share information in the greater good of our clients. So data sharing is a really tricky one. There's privacy issues. There's a whole lot in Victoria. You know, I don't know about, you know, all your countries and what your laws are, but we take it very seriously. So we do share data for the greater good, and we share generic data. So I've got a planning session with all the third sector in a week from now. So we're going to go from 53,000 Paul to the size of your municipality very soon. So, you know, planning is today for the next 20 years, 30 years. And I've got them all in a room going, how are we going to create the Mitchell that we want communities to feel fantastic. So all the learnings, which is why I'm going to email you, Paul, I want, because I've got sliding door moments with other big local government areas who've done it really well and not well. So data is key to getting things a bit more right, and sharing data, because with data, you can make it. They're my dogs. You can make really great informed decisions. Sorry. No,
that's fine. Hannah, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just to say, because I have that oversight across the 32 local authorities in Scotland, what we're seeing is there's a huge variation in how people are using data and how risk averse local authorities and their partners are about what they share. So we're doing a bit of work at the moment with, it's an organisation called Savvy, and I think it's a scalable approach to vulnerability via interoperability. They're very techie data people, but they're going to do some work with 4 local authorities in Scotland to try and map out what can you share about low-income families, with who, what are the legal obstacles you need to get through, and to really put out a roadmap of what they think, with their informed sort of legal heads on, can be shared, to try and provide a bit of reassurance around that, because I feel like there's 32 areas all going through the same headache, nightmare of understanding what they can do in relation to the GDPR legislation. So
I think that's really interesting and really important, because I certainly feel that over the years I've sat in a lot of rooms where you have kind of tech people saying, yeah, you just need to share this and do this and you can make all these amazing things happen, and local government people saying, no, we can't do that because and I sit there thinking, oh, they're both right. So, how do you find a middle way? I mean, that sort of cues up my next question, I guess, which was around, local government has, well, all of us, not just local government, the world has kind of moved from crisis to crisis. So we had the pandemic, we've moved straight into a sort of cost of living crisis. And I think if we wanted to be kind of glass half full about things, both of those crises have pushed us to accelerate kind of partnership working, to accelerate, some of the ways in which we interact with people, find new innovation, different ways of working. How do we take the learning from that and the momentum from that and sort of try and play it into sort of business as usual, if we ever get to business as usual? I don't know, Rory, Paul, Mary, Alison, are you sort of consciously finding ways to sort of lock in those sort of emergency partnership responses and sort of shape them into the future? Rory.
I think, Jonathan, it's a great point. I think certainly from our point of view, one of the key learnings has been how well the warm spaces have kind of operated by bringing in wider partners, to Mary's point. So, for example, in some of our warm spaces in kind of town centre cafes or in libraries, we've had our support team go around, we've had fire and rescue there, we've had age concern there, we've had all these other kind of support agencies that probably wouldn't have been able to talk to different people in very specific localities, all going out and kind of doing that joined up multi-agency partnership approach. So I think to try and build on that and going forward would be really beneficial, so we can target particular areas, have people go out and actually find out what's happening on the ground and offer real support like that. So that partnership approach has been fantastic and something we're really keen to kind of build on from a kind of locality place-based point of view. I guess the flip side to that is the amount of resource that takes and the amount of coordination that takes to do that. But I guess that's a challenge with constrained local authority and partner budgets.
And that, I guess, in some ways takes us back to Hannah's original kind of question / provocation on how do you balance intervention with sort of long-term strategic change? I mean, Hannah, to put you on the spot a bit, is there anything you've heard this morning that kind of gives you that answers that question in any way for you?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is a one answer to it. I think it's just continuing to have that dual focus all the time. And even when you're doing an emergency sort of intervention, building a long-term approach into that. So if you have someone presenting at a food bank, how can you use that interaction as an opportunity to build a relationship with that person, take that no wrong door approach so that you can then refer them into employability support if that's what they need, welfare rights support, social work, housing, so that at least for that one person you can begin to take a preventative approach. But at the same time, you obviously have to take your learning from that to understand, well, why did they end up in the food bank in the first place? Is it the transport infrastructure? Is it lack of childcare that means employment in this area is actually impossible if you've got kids?
Unless you live in Victoria, where you get free kindergarten, it transfers.
Yeah, here too, 3 and 4 and vulnerable twos get free.
Just us. Alison is making a really interesting point about. Well, Alison, say that's interesting, isn't it? The future, the Welsh future generations.
Yes, I suppose whenever you ask the question, Jonathan, I suppose what struck me first of all was it's kind of a mixture of people, systems, and the accountability all matching up. And I think so. My reflection on, suppose, the last 5 years really has been that where you have good people, things work well, and people who have, the kind of the values that match what needs to be done. And sometimes when those people step away, because inevitably they are great and they move on to other things, and sometimes it becomes so obvious that the system and the accountability wasn't there to make it true, no matter who was in the role. And I think future generations starts to build that accountability. Obviously we have community planning partnerships here, but there's no real accountability attached to it. There's no There's no reporting mechanism where people have to actually evidence what it is they're doing, and screening around, you know, that kind of prepping for future generations. So it's an interesting concept. It's getting a bit of traction here in Northern Ireland in terms of having conversations. But for me, you cannot just assume that you get the culture and mindset right and that will answer the problems, because you will never totally get the culture and mindset right in public services. We just have to accept that it's a constant journey. So therefore, there needs to be something about the system that's independent of the person in terms of providing top class public services, and the accountability then back kind of, you know, closes that circle for me.
I think that's a super important point. And actually, sometimes when you have really excellent people, it kind of lets you actually don't put the systems in place because you sort of feel you don't need to, and then you find they're not there. Right, we're pushing time, and I promised I'd finish on time. But I mean, Claudia, very quick point.
Sorry, I just wanted to touch briefly on, we have, as you probably have over there, a housing crisis issue at the moment. We have a situation where there's a lot of Airbnbs, so we have no long-term rentals because they're taken up into, you know, the short-term accommodation space. I remember when I lived in the UK, they had like a bed tax. I'm not sure if you still have that, but what are your thoughts on, you know, Airbnb becoming, you know, higher rated or bed tax on holiday accommodation to help counter with this long-term housing situation?
So, Claudia, what often happens in these conversations is just as we get to the end, someone opens a massive can of worms and throws it onto the table in a way that we can't possibly, and I'm afraid that is what you have just done. But we have future events coming up on homelessness, on housing. I think one of the things we're really interested in, because all the jurisdictions we work with, Ireland, the UK, Australia, a housing crisis is a common thread through all of them. So we will be back to answer that question. So I think, in fact, that cues me brilliantly to sort of close on a bit of a cliffhanger. We will come back to look at those issues very specifically. But for now, look, I'd just like to say thank you to all of our speakers here today. As I said, we have recorded the session, so we'll put that up on our website if you want to come back and look at that. We'd love you to come to future panels. Our next one is on the 18th of May at 8:30 British time. Don't know what time that is in Australia, but we'll communicate that, which is going to be working with our partners at the Victorian Local Governance Association to look at long-term financial sustainability, which is also a massive issue. And we'll be coming back to questions around homelessness, questions around coastal communities, etc. I think that was excellent. You know, we at LGIU, we firmly believe that when ideas are shared, when we talk about these things, we bring these sort of global challenges down to earth, because they're global problems, but they land in real communities, in local communities. So it's really useful to get the insight on that. So thank you very much. Thank you to Hannah and our partners at IS. Thank you to Rory, to Alison, to Mary, and to Paul. But most of all, thank you to all of you for coming out this morning / this evening. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.